Today, I'm going to be reviewing Sigma's brightest ultra-wide-angle zoom lens, the Sigma 14 to 24mm f2.8 DG HSM art lens. And I'm going to start right now. Announced back in February of 2018, this lens here is incredibly popular with a lot of landscape and astrophotographers thanks to its very versatile ultra-wide angle focal range, as well as having a consistent bright aperture of f2.8, great in a low light environment and especially astrophotography, as well as it's far cheaper than the Canon and Nikon and Sony equivalent lenses, coming in at around £1,200 brand new, which is around £1,000 cheaper than the Canon EF 16 to 35mm f2.8. But does it still hold up in image quality today, especially when we compare it to more modern mirrorless lenses, like for example the RF 15 to 35mm f2.8? To find that out, I headed to La Palma, which is in the Canary Islands. So firstly, why have I come to La Palma and why is it so good for astrophotography? Well, astrophotography, to take an absolute perfect image, is determined by quite a few external factors like climate, weather, elevation and light pollution. And La Palma actually ticks basically every single box an astrophotographer needs to take an absolute perfect image. Now, the first external factor to take into consideration is light pollution. If you speak to any astrophotographer, the likelihood they've probably mentioned light pollution in the first couple of sentences. And it's a really big thing to take into consideration. The more light pollution, the less light and stars you'll see in the night sky. And what's special about La Palma versus basically anywhere else in the world is they've got really low light pollution. But actually, they've got laws on light pollution. When you drive around, you'll notice how dark it is. They don't even fly planes at night to reduce the amount of light pollution, which is why on the top of the highest point, which is where I am now, there's a whole bunch of telescopes, around 17, and it's all down to light pollution. Now, two other things to think about when it comes to astrophotography is elevation and weather. Weather being probably the biggest determining factor. If it is a cloudy night, you're not going to be able to photograph the stars, doesn't matter how low light pollution it is. And then again, that's what's great about La Palma. All of the cloud, because of how high we are, most of the cloud is in the valley. So most of the nights, around 330 nights a year, we've got absolute perfect clear skies. As well, thanks to the elevation, you've got less atmosphere to shoot through. So instead of being at sea level, which you've got a lot of atmosphere and a lot of atmospheric disturbance, 2,500 meters up, which is where I am now, there's far less atmosphere to shoot through, which means you're going to end up with cleaner images, which is really important for astrophotography, especially if you're shooting at the horizon, which hopefully the Milky Way will be over here in about 10 hours or so. So this lens is made of a full metal construction with a metal lens mount. This lens also comes with weather sealing as well. So if you are shooting in the great outdoors, this is going to be super helpful thanks to the weather sealing gasket that you can see at the rear of the lens. But it also has a few more features that make it really useful for landscape photographers. It's got a really handy and large focus and zoom ring, as well as a decent sized autofocus to manual focus switch. All of that means is, well, you can use this lens with gloves on, which again, if you are shooting in a cold environment, is super useful. It's also fully internally zooming and internally focusing, and you've also got a really handy focus window at the front of the lens as well. Now, this lens does have a very complicated optical formula with a giant bulbous front element, as you can see, with a whopping 17 elements in 11 groups, which does make this lens very big and very heavy, coming in at over a kilogram at 1.15 kilos or 2.54 pounds, which is around 300 grams heavier than the Canon equivalent ultra-wide angle zoom lens. That lens there only comes in at around 790 grams or 1.74 pounds, or the newer RF 15 to 35mm, that lens there only comes in at 840 grams or 1.85 pounds. So you'll definitely notice hiking and carrying this lens around just due to the heavier nature and the more complicated optical formula. One of the disadvantages of using this lens for landscape photography though is there's no filter thread. Because of the giant bulbous front element and built-in lens hood, there's no filter thread with this lens, so you're not going to be able to attach
normal neutral density filters or circular polarizer filters, you're going to have to go for the optional gel filters that fit at the rear of the lens. And if we have a look at the size chart here, we can see that it's considerably larger than the Canon EF and Canon RF ultra wide angle f2.8 lenses. So this is going to take up more room in your camera bag. But this lens does have a very handy and very useful focal range of 14mm, which is around 114 degrees field of view, all the way to 24mm, which is more standard wide angle, making this lens excel at landscape and astrophotography. I really did find myself shooting around 14mm most of the time to capture the amazing panoramic views that La Palma had to offer, as well as it's got a super handy aperture of f2.8, all the way through its focal range, making it very useful if you're planning on shooting in a low light environment. Again, astrophotography, you're always shooting in a very dark environment. La Palma is one of the best places. In fact, it's the second best place in the Northern Hemisphere to shoot astrophotography. And I must say the photos that I got with this lens were absolutely exceptional, thanks to that f2.8 aperture. I was able to shoot wide open, be pin sharp, as well as I could shoot at lower ISOs versus other lenses with maybe an f4 aperture or even darker. So if you are a landscape or astrophotographer, this lens here really has the best combination. Ultra wide angle, as well as quite bright with an f2.8 aperture. I thought it was also really sharp as well. A lot of the sample images here, I didn't really have to do much sharpening, as well as corner image sharpness was as good as the center, which usually is something that a lot of ultra wide angle lenses suffer from. Now, if we have a look at a few graph images, we can see if we go ahead and zoom in at the center at f2.8 at 14mm, we're getting really good sharpness. But if we go over to the corners, the sharpness stays, which is really important. Now, we can improve it if we step down to f4, f5.6 and f8, but this lens is incredibly sharp and very consistent all the way through its field of view, all the way to 24mm. Again, if we zoom in at 24mm at f2.8, again, we're getting really good center sharpness. And if we go over to the corners, we're getting really good corner image sharpness as well, which is really important if you are an astrophotographer. We can improve that further by stepping down to f4, f5.6, all the way to f8, although I do find it softening beyond f16, and then f22 is quite soft. So actually, for landscape and astrophotography, corner image sharpness was as good as the Canon lens, although it's £1,000 cheaper. Flaring was also really good as well. Again, shooting really wide angle, the likelihood you're probably gonna get some kind of light source in your image, so flaring really needs to be considered with lenses like this. And actually, the flaring was really good. Even when pointing it directly towards the sun at sunset, you can see there's no odd flaring artifacts and there's not much loss in contrast, which is really good. I think this is thanks to how the lenses were constructed, as well as, of course, it's got a built-in lens hood, which helps odd flaring artifacts from appearing in your images and also video. Distortion and vignetting was also quite good as well. Sure, there's a mild amount of distortion at 14mm, something that you'd expect from all ultra wide angle zoom lenses, but it's not as bad as I was expecting. And it's the same situation with vignetting. There's a small amount of vignetting when you turn profile corrections off, but we can push that to the corners at f4 and it pretty much disappears at f5.6 and f8. And it's the same situation at 24mm. Sure, there's a mild amount of pincushion distortion, but it's very, very subtle, a very flat profile. And again, that vignetting is a little bit there, but you can push it to the corners at f4 and it pretty much disappears at f5.6. So you can turn profile corrections on, but it's not gonna make a massive difference to your photos. The only thing that isn't amazing with this lens is the macro performance and the minimum focus distance of just 26 centimeters with a maximum reproduction ratio of just 0.18. And actually, image quality close-up wasn't very good. It was a little bit soft. We can improve it if we step down to f4, f5.6 all the way to f8. But the only thing that I found disappointing with this lens was the macro performance. But to be honest with you, if you're a landscape or astrophotographer, macro performance isn't really that important. Something is important though is the autofocus of this lens, and actually it was really good. Sure, it wasn't as fast as modern mirrorless lenses like, for example, my RF 15 to 35mm, that's a lot more snappier, but for a DSLR lens with a HSM motor, I thought it was actually quite fast and quite responsive. It was definitely louder than some other lenses that I've used, but I never really found an issue when focusing, even when I was shooting in a very dark environment. And of course, when you're using it in manual focus, you've got a really handy autofocus to manual focus switch on the side of the lens, as well as you've got a super handy focus window, which I find very useful to have, especially if you're always switching into manual focus. Again, as a landscape photographer, I don't always shoot in autofocus. Sometimes I find the subject, switch it into manual, so then I can go ahead and take a bunch of photos. So actually, I found for autofocus performance and manual focus performance, this lens was very useful. But of course, this lens doesn't come with image stabilization. So if you are someone that's wanting to buy a lens for photo and video, personally, I wouldn't recommend this lens. It's got no image stabilization, and of course, there's no way of attaching a neutral density filter as there's no filter thread. So if you're after a lens that's really good for photo and video, this lens definitely isn't for you. So as you can see, this lens really did held up its own when it comes to image quality, build quality, and overall lens performance. It really is one of the best lenses I think you can buy if you're a landscape and astrophotographer, especially if you don't want to fork out around £2,500 for a modern mirrorless lens like the RF 15-35mm. These lenses are incredibly similar when it comes to image quality, although you are getting a few more benefits with this lens, like for example, a slightly more useful focal range of 15-35mm versus 14-24mm, plus it does come with image stabilization, but it is around £1,500 more. So in fact, you'd be able to buy this lens, drop it off a mountain, buy it again, and you'd still be better off if you just bought one of these lenses. So it really does show you the value for money you can get with this lens here. But of course, the size and weight aspect is something you can't forget. And with an overall score of just 36 out of 50, this is a recommended lens to have in your camera bag. But of course, write it down in the comments below. What do you think? Would you buy an older DSLR lens like this because of the amazing image quality and value for money? Or are you someone that's doesn't really like DSLR lenses anymore? Forget about the EF to RF adapter and just use mirrorless lenses instead, like this one here. Make sure to go ahead and write it down in the comments below. Thank you to all of my YouTube members that are currently supporting the channel. If you guys want to support the channel and get some awesome perks, including free Lightroom presets like the ones that you can see on screen, make sure to go ahead to the link in the description. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next week.